the only safe way to do it without legal pressure from the courts. But the amount of hand-wringing that my colleagues did, oh man, people are going to be mad at me. People are going to be upset with me. Why would we do this? It's such a small population. On and on and on. It is our job to stand up and to make decisions. And yes, people do get mad at us. And that's not easy. But that's why we're paid the big bucks. I should tell people what we earn in Vermont. Not very much. So it's been 36 years since the War Powers Act was passed. Is it working? Is it even being followed? I would say a decision to go to war is maybe one of the most serious ones a nation ever makes. And whether you believe that wars are horrible and should never happen, or that wars are a horrible necessity, we will have more wars. And we owe it to ourselves to make sure that the legal underpinnings, the process that we go through in deciding to go to war, is a process that is firm, that works in a crisis, because it's always a crisis when we decide to go to war. And so I would say we owe it to ourselves. We owe it to the young men and women who are fighting in our military. We owe it to the world to make sure that we have a much tighter process. Thank you. So since we are moderatorless, or maybe I am moderator, I am shifting gears and want to introduce my new friend, Rich Madaleno from the Maryland Senate, who will introduce himself a little bit more. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. You're going to have an interesting few minutes as you are entertained by the Maryland State Senate's version of Martin and Lewis here with Senator Raskin and myself. I represent Kensington, Chevy Chase, Wheaton, and the western neighborhoods of Silver Spring in the Maryland State Senate. I grew up in Montgomery County and I live in Kensington. I have the distinct honor for people in this room to be both the only openly gay and only openly Unitarian member. Yay! I figured that would get a greater hand. So I come to this struggle with a variety of backgrounds. Last year, probably like many of you in the room who might be locals, you might spend a lot of time listening to the Diane Reed show and WAMU. And I think it was last year or 2 years ago, I heard Norman Ornstein on the radio from the American Enterprise Institute, and he was talking, among many things, I guess he's designated as a congressional scholar. And he was providing an overview of the Republican Congress during the Bush years. And the observation that he made was that he was quite troubled, in his opinion, to have seen the Republican majority in the Congress during the Bush presidency evolve from being a congressional majority to being a parliamentary majority. And that it was quite unhealthy for our system to have one of our political parties in the legislative branch begin to view itself in a parliamentary way as opposed to in a congressional way, honoring the checks and balances that are inherent within our system. And I know we all struggle as legislators, and I think right now, Jamie and I have the pleasure to serve in a state where the governor is of the same party as the majorities in the legislature. Mike, you're in the opposite situation. In my prior term in the House, I served with a Republican governor. But as a legislator, and I think this goes back to maybe the point you made at the end of Mr. Halpern's remarks. As a legislator, you take an oath, and you have a responsibility toward your position and to the office that you've been elected to, and not necessarily to your party and to your executive. And I'm sure you're going to. Oh, thank you. and I'm sure that I wasn't making it as a criticism of Governor O'Malley, but I don't necessarily agree with him on everything. And I think it'll be interesting to hear, and I'm sorry that I can't stay for Mr. Swanson's remarks later, when I was looking at his book outside with this whole idea of the imperial presidency and the imperial executive, and one of the how our system has evolved at the national and even at the state level. I don't know what it's like in Vermont. I can only sit and imagine if it's a place that has Ben & Jerry's, it is different than the rest of the country. But even in our own small state, you've seen the power of the executive vis-a-vis the legislative branch, and the amount of pressure that we come under to just follow along with the executive, because that's a good thing for the party, and it might be a good thing for the party, and it might be a good thing for the executive, but isn't a good thing for our system. Now, I come to this because Gene Athey brought me Mike Fisher's, I'm sorry, I keep calling you Mike Lewis. Mike Fisher, oh my goodness, Mike Fisher's Vermont resolution to say, can we do something like this in Maryland? And we talked about it from the Iraq War perspective, and it struck me that maybe what we needed to do was present something a little bit different in Maryland, and not a resolution specifically about the Iraq War, but an actual law, a change in the law to give the governor the power to say no to the president when there wasn't a valid authorization of military force in place any longer. Now, obviously, it grows out of the Iraq conflict and our belief that authorization is no longer valid. And in fact, the first time it really struck me was several years ago when Senator John Warner made that observation in a congressional hearing that the authorization was no longer valid because Saddam had been removed, and we knew the status of weapons of mass destruction, yet this conflict was still going on, and our brave men and women were still being asked to go over to fight what conflict? And that it was entirely to the president to define exactly what the conflict was and who was fighting it. And that's not, as you heard before, as you're going to hear today, as all you believe, it's not how the system works. It's not how the founders intended for the system to work. And if Congress wasn't going to step up and to use its powers, that we as state legislators had to stand up and give our governors, and I hesitate to say, having just given a little explanation of why giving the executive is too much power, we're granting more, in essence, authority to the executive, but the executive, the governor, is given the role of being the commander-in-chief of the National Guards in the various states. So giving that authority to a governor to say, no, you cannot use our forces that way is very important. And the more research I did into this, and I mean, many of you in this room may have served in Vietnam, participated in the debate in our nation over the Vietnam conflict. I didn't. I was not either born or old enough to do that. But looking back upon it and doing some of the research, and I think Mike and I was looking at your notes as you were talking, stumbled upon the same things, this understanding of the use of the National Guard and of total force policy, I think is the right Pentagon term, with the idea that one of the things that the Army leadership decided, and looking back upon the Vietnam experience, was that, and maybe everyone in this room already knows this, or someone else has spoken about it at the conference, but it was decided that one of the failures of the Vietnam experience was the military lost the support at the home front. And that the way to both ensure the support in the home front and of the political leadership was to evolve total force policy to make any prolonged foreign conflict dependent upon the deployment of the National Guard. So instead of the lesson of the Vietnam era of President Johnson being able to make a decision to send more troops and just continue to send the standing army and have it in some ways divorced from what was going on in the rest of the country, that by sending the National Guard, you would trigger you would trigger legislative action. You would trigger the authorization of military force. You would trigger a greater political debate on the front end than after the conflict had gone on for a while. And that by doing so, you would ensure participation and of the public, support of the public and of the political process, and you would ensure yourself a short conflict, because who would want to deploy the National Guard for a long period of time? And those were all laid out clearly in the concepts of total force policy in the mid-70s. And then we run into September 11th, 2001, and everyone ditched it. Everyone decided, I mean, the